We're going to begin the mechanical inspection of the vehicle by first looking under the hood. First, we're going to have an overall look at the engine. If it's nice and clean, it means that the owner probably took good care of the car. The first thing I always look at when looking at an engine is the motor oil, and that gives a good indication of the condition of the engine. In this case here, we can see that the oil is nice and full, and that indicates at least that the engine is not burning any oil. The other thing to look at is the color of the motor oil. If the oil is nice and clean and honey colored, and you know it's been freshly changed, which is pretty good. If it's really dark and black, then you know the car has probably been neglected and it hasn't been changed in a while. But if it's a coffee or creamy color and it's got a lot of bubbles in it, that probably means that the coolant is leaking into the engine oil through the head gasket, and that's an expensive repair. The next thing I have a look at is under the oil cap. I'm going to look inside of the valve cover to see if we see any oil, sludge, or any crap like that in there. We're also going to have a look under the oil cap and have a look to see if we see any sludge buildup or any milky residue or condensation. That can indicate again that there's a head gasket issue and coolant is getting into the engine oil. Next, we're going to look at the transmission oil. And if we have a look at the dipstick here, the level of the oil means nothing when the car is off. Usually they measure it when the car is on and in park. But we can have a look at the color of the oil and the smell of it. If it smells really burnt and is a dark color, that's not a good sign, and it means that the clutch packs inside of the transmission are probably burning up and on their way out, which is a very expensive repair. But if it's brownish, like in this case, that's not too bad and it could probably just use an oil change. And if it's bright red and clean, that means it's just been freshly changed. Have a look at the battery, especially the terminals, to see if there's any corrosion or buildup, because that could cause a loose connection. We're also going to have a look at the sticker to determine the age of the battery. Generally, batteries last anywhere between 4 to 6 years. And some batteries actually have an indicator that tells you when you need to top up the fluid. We're also going to check the level of the coolant in the reservoir and also the color. Usually on Toyotas, it's a pink or a red color. And we're also going to check the power steering fluid, and the color of it should be bright red if it's been freshly changed. If it's brown or black, the fluid should be changed. If it's low, that means that there's probably a leak in the power steering system somewhere. Check the radiator cap, take it off, have a look at it to make sure that it's the original cap and hasn't been replaced. You're also going to want to check to make sure the fluid is topped off right up to here. Also have a look underneath the cap itself for any milky residue. That could indicate that the oil is getting into the coolant and you have a problem with the head gasket. Have a look at the level of fluid in the master cylinder reservoir. If the color of the fluid looks quite dark or burnt, that could mean that the brakes were overheating at some point and the rotors could be warped. If the level of the fluid looks a bit on the low side, that could mean that the brake pads are worn. You're also going to want to have a look at all the brake lines and the area underneath the master cylinder to see if it's been leaking. I'm going to remove the engine cover so you can have a closer look at the engine. So I'm just going to have an overall look at the engine to make sure that there's nothing that's loose or missing and all the connectors are there. Have a look at the fuel injectors to make sure they're all intact and not leaking. If your spark plugs are on top and really accessible like this one, it might actually be worth the 30 seconds to pull them out and have a look. If they look nice and clean, check to make sure that they've been replaced with an OEM component and that they're the right type for the vehicle. You're also going to want to check the tip of the spark plug. If it's black and crusty like this one, that could indicate that the car is burning oil or running too lean or rich, and you could have a problem with the engine. Have a look at both radiator hoses to make sure that they're not too mushy or soft. They're nice and firm and there's no cracks or any leaking. Have a look at the coolant fans and make sure they spin freely. And also have a look at all the air conditioner lines for any dye or any liquid leaking from them. Have a look around the valve cover where it seals against the engine for any leaks. These Toyota V6 engines are very notorious for having the rear valve cover gasket leaking. So run your finger along the back here and make sure that there's no leaking or drippage. Another way to tell if a car has been cared for is if it's been replaced with OEM components. As you can see, this starter here is not Toyota original. It doesn't have the stamp on it. But thankfully, if you move over to the alternator here, you can see the original Toyota stamp on it. So this is probably the original alternator. Check all the accessory belts on the car. Make sure that they're nice and flexible and not too loose. And also if they're frayed or they're cracked, they're going to need to be replaced. We're also going to want to make sure the timing belt has been replaced at some point. You can usually find a sticker either on the timing cover, on the driver's door jamb, or through dealership records. Have a look at the dog bone engine mount. If there's a lot of cracking going along around here, which these cars are pretty notorious about, that could mean that the other engine mounts are getting worn out too. Have a look at the top of the strut mount. Usually clean bolts like this means the strut has been recently replaced. Have a look at the oil filter and make sure that it's nice and clean and there's no oil leaks. Usually the brand name of the filter kind of tells you where the previous owner has been servicing the car, so if this was a Toyota filter, it probably means he took it to the dealer for the last oil change. Some shops will actually write the date on here when the last time your oil was changed, so that could give you an idea of when the car was last serviced. Sometimes oil change stickers along the windshield or the door jambs could tell you when last the oil was changed. I'm going to remove the air filter to have a look. This is the air filter. Check to see that it's nice and clean, or if it needs to be changed. Have a look around the engine bay for any loose connections or any wiring indicating that somebody could have been doing some aftermarket work to this car. Have a look at the radiator and air conditioner condenser to make sure that there's no fluid leaks or any stone chips, or if the bottom of it is rusting out. Make sure that there's enough washer fluid, otherwise the tank could be leaking. Now I'm going to jack up the vehicle. We're going to have a look at the wheel of the car, particularly the rim. Have a look at the condition of the rims for any scratches or any curb rash. That usually indicates what type of person drove the car. We're also going to look for any bends in the rim overall, and make sure that these rims match on all four sides of the car. So if there's a lot of brake dust buildup on the inside of the rim, that could indicate either the caliper is seizing or they use the cheap metallic brake pad as a replacement part that's going to wear out pretty quickly. Now we're going to grab on the tires at 9 and 3 o'clock and pull the wheel like this. If there's any play, that indicates that the tire rod ends are worn and will need to be replaced. Now we're going to grab on the tire at 12 and 6 o'clock and pull it back and forth, feeling for any play. If there's any play, that could indicate that the ball joints are worn and will need to be replaced because that's dangerous. Now we're also going to feel for play in the other diagonal directions, and if there is play, that could indicate that the wheel bearing is worn out. Have a look at the struts and the springs, make sure there's no broken springs. And the struts, make sure that there's no oil residue leaking from them. And these rubber bellows and the bump stops at the top, make sure that they're not cracked or falling off and need to be replaced. Bounce up and down on each corner of the car to check the struts. And then release, and if the car bounces up more than 1.5 times, that could mean that the strut is blown. Let's talk about tires. Tire wear is important in judging how a car has been maintained or driven. If the middle band of this tire here is more worn out, that indicates that the tire has been overinflated. If the outer two bands are worn out more than the inner bands, that means that the tire has been underinflated. If you run your fingers across this way and you feel bumps, like every other thread is going high and low, that indicates that the suspension of the car, the struts, are worn out. And because the struts are worn out, as the car goes over bumps, the tire is absorbing all the shock, and that's causing the threads to go up and down. This tire will be really noisy on the road. One more thing to look out for is these small cracks. Usually these cracks means that the tire is aging and will need to be replaced soon. And the thread depth, which is usually determined by these pre-molded wear bars in the tires. When the depth of this thread equals the depth of this wear gauge, these tires need to be replaced. Also, while you're on the side of the tire, you're going to have a look at the dot code, and at the end of the dot code there's usually a 4-digit number. If it's not on one side, it'll be on the other side of the tire. This indicates the week and the year that the tire has been manufactured. Generally speaking, tires last between 6 and 10 years, so after about that time the tires will need to be replaced. So in this case, this tire was made in the 11th week of 2008. Looking on the side of the tire, you're going to want to make sure that the make, model, and tire size, as well as the thread depth, matches on each axle of the car. So here we are under the car. The first thing we're going to have a look at is the overall condition, especially the frame. You want to make sure that there's no rust, there's no dents, and there's no scuffs where it probably ran over something that it wasn't supposed to run over. And of course, to make sure there's no signs that it's ever been on a frame machine. This black oily residue is actually pretty good. It indicates the car has been rust proof. Have a look at the oil pan. Make sure that there's no leaks around the gasket or the drain plug, and that the thing is not rusting out. Then have a look at the transmission pan and make sure it's not leaking. Now if the area between the transmission and the engine is leaking, like in this area here, that can indicate that the rear main seal is leaking. That's a very expensive job because you have to remove the entire transmission to access the seal. Have a look at the exhaust system from top all the way to the bottom. Make sure that there's no rust areas or holes and that there's no patchwork that's been done. It looks like this flex pipe is leaking. Have a look at the CV axle where it meets the transmission and make sure it's not leaking. You can also get a good glimpse of the steering rack from the bottom where it meets the inner tie rod and check to see if it's leaking. Now I'm going to remove the wheel. With the wheel out of the way, we're going to inspect the brakes. The first thing I'm going to look at is the brake caliper and see what kind of condition it's under. If there's any rust or any leaking from the leader valve. Then have a look at the brake pad material, which is down in there. Generally speaking, if the brake pad material thickness is equal or less than the backing material thickness, it's about time to replace that brake pad. Have a look at the brake rotors. Run your finger up and down to see if you feel any grooves, and look for rusty areas or spots that the brake pad hasn't been touching. That could indicate any problems with the calipers or warped rotors. Check all the brake hoses for flex. This is a stabilizer linkage. Grab onto it and pull it really hard to see if you feel any looseness. Usually when these bushings get worn out, it tends to cause a clunking noise when you're going over bumps. Have a look at the inner drive shaft boot and also the inner tie rod boot to make sure that they're not leaking. This is the stabilizer bar bushing where it attaches to the frame. I'm going to tug on this and make sure it's nice and tight. In this case, it looks like it has been replaced. Sometimes these cause noise when going over bumps as well. This is the outer tie rod. You want to make sure that there's no grease or anything leaking from here and that this bushing is nice and soft, and give it a tug to make sure that there's no looseness. This is the control arm bushing. Check to make sure that there's no cracks or anything like that. It's kind of a lot of labor to take these out and change them because the entire steering knuckle has to come off. Have a look at the lower ball joint to make sure that it's not leaking and that the bushing is filled with grease. Check to make sure that the CV joints are intact and not leaking. On these cars, it's a lot of labor to replace because often at times this axle gets seized to that bearing. This here is the rear engine mount. You're going to want to inspect the rubber around it because a lot of times this will fail first, causing the other mounts to wear out. Here at the back, I'm going to check the tire thread and also the tire size to make sure it matches the other side. I'm going to rotate it to make sure it moves nice and freely and the parking brake is not catching. And I'm also going to wiggle it side to side to check for some play in the wheel bearing. Also look at the rear struts to make sure the springs are okay and the struts are not leaking. It's also a good idea to remove the rear wheel and inspect the brakes and the rotors. Have a look at the gas tank on the car to make sure that there's no leaks, it's securely tied down, and there's no rust spots. Now that we've completed an overall inspection of the engine area, it's time to start it up and listen out for any dry bearings or squeaky belts. We're going to start the car. And we're going to check to make sure that all the gauges and the lights are working and that when you start the car, all of the warning lights disappear. Check the exhaust system after the car has just been started for any repairs or any leaks. Some steam and water on a cold start from the exhaust is okay, but if the smoke is coming out really black or blue, that could indicate the car is burning oil or the valve stem seals are leaking. Sometimes you can also feel an oily residue on the bumper around the tailpipe. The first thing I'm going to do is go around an engine and make sure that there's no strange noises. As you can tell, there's a little bit of valve chatter, but that's okay for an engine this old. I'm going to put my hand on the engine and rev it a little bit to see how smooth the engine runs. If it's running rough, that means one of the cylinders are misfiring. Next, I'm going to check the engine blow-by. Usually if there's a lot of air coming out of here, that could indicate that the car has high mileage or that there's a cylinder that's misfiring or has bad compression. With the transmission in park and the vehicle level, I'm going to check the transmission fluid and make sure it's on the cold mark if the engine is cold. Now I'm going to run through the gears on the transmission to see how the engine moves. That could indicate if I've got a bad engine mount. Now I'm going to turn on the air conditioner and listen for a change in the idle. Check that the AC clutch on the compressor is engaged. If it's turning on and off consistently, that means it's low on Freon. Check that both of the radiator fans are working. Turn the steering wheel lock to lock and listen for any strange noises. Pump the brakes and make sure they become nice and firm and they don't sink down to the ground. That could indicate a bad master cylinder. Rev the engine and see how it sounds. through all the gears on the transmission and see how it shifts. I'm going to do a quick load check on the starter and the battery. I'm going to turn the headlights on, turn the radio on, turn the wipers on, turn the HVAC system up, and then start the car and see how it behaves. It starts right up. I'm going to have a look underneath the car while it's running to make sure that there's nothing leaking. Have a look at the tailpipe residue. If there's a lot of black, thick residue, that's not good. That means the engine is burning oil. Look where the car's been normally parked and see if you can find any oil residue where it's been leaking.